My name is Dr. Katarina Standish, and on behalf of the Arthur V. Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice at St. Paul's College at the University of Manitoba, welcome. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement that we're on Treaty 1 territory, and our talk today is on the land that belongs to the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. This is our third and final brown bag lecture for the fall term, and it is taking place both in person and online. The lecture will be recorded and broadcast on the Morrow YouTube channel. So today's presentation will be followed by a question and answer session, and online viewers are requested please to type their questions into the Q&A box on that Zoom platform. But just before we begin today's lecture, I would just like to cordially invite everybody to join us next week for the 2023 Soul Canny Lecture for Peace and Justice. We are very, very happy to be featuring Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire and the Lieutenant General's lecture, Peace, Faith, and Humanity in Times of Crisis, will be held next week on Thursday at 1:30 in the Manitoba room at University Centre. That lecture is an in-person lecture only. It is now my pleasure and honor to introduce our brown bag lecturer, Ashley Heller. Ashley is a research technician at Resolve, the Research and Education for Solutions to Violence and Abuse Research Network. They are a community-based network that engages in work aimed at reducing the incidence and impact of family and gender-based violence, including violence against women and girls. Ashley earned her BA from the University of Winnipeg with a double major in political science and writing and communication. She holds a Master's of Human Rights from the University of Manitoba. So in today's lecture, Ashley explores the applicability of the labels of extremism, violent extremism, and terrorism for misogynistic violence through the tragic events of the Montreal Massacre in 1989 and the Toronto van attack in 2018 here in Canada. She argues that these designations are not only applicable to misogynistic violence, but necessary in changing the way these acts are understood. This emerging framework more adequately addresses the gendered basis for these crimes, while also presenting the opportunity for more promising responses to these acts moving forward. Ashley's recent publication on the topic can be found in Perspectives on Justice, Indigeneity, Gender, and Security in Human Rights Research from Palgrave Macmillan. And we are very pleased to welcome Ashley to the Brown Bag Lecture podium. Ashley.
So before we get started, I just wanted to give a trigger warning about today's content. We're going to be discussing some heavy subject matter, so if at any time anyone needs to take a break, please feel free to do so. And if at any time I need to speak loudly, or if you can't hear me, please also let me know. There we go. On a December afternoon in 1989, Marc Lépine entered École Polytechnique in Montreal, armed with a semi-automatic rifle disguised in a garbage bag. He walked into a classroom of aspiring engineers and ordered the men and women into separate groups. He then opened fire on the female group whilst proclaiming, "You're all a bunch of feminists and I hate feminists." 6 of those women died instantly. He then moved throughout the school, killing 8 more women before taking his own life. He left a suicide note which bemoaned, "I have decided to send the feminists who have always ruined my life to their maker." The attack, which is now known as the Montreal Massacre, remains one of the deadliest shootings in Canadian history. Almost 3 years later, Alec Manassian barreled a speeding van through a busy Toronto street, killing 10 people and injuring many others. Through this act of violence, he hoped to inspire an uprising in the incel community. Incels are an online network of men who promote misogyny and violence against women in retribution for their unsuccessful romantic endeavors. Some incels even believe that Marc Lépine is a founding father of their community and herald him as a hero. The two of the deadliest attacks ever perpetrated on Canadian soil have one thing in common. They were motivated by misogyny. Canadian feminists have thus called for these attacks to be recognized for their political and ideological nature as gender-based extremism and terrorism. So as mentioned, today we are going to explore the applicability for the labels extremism, violent extremism, and terrorism for misogynistic violence through the events of the Montreal Massacre and Toronto van attack in Canada. And as a spoiler alert, I do indeed argue that these labels are not only applicable but necessary, since the language that we use to describe these attacks can greatly impact how they are understood and how they are acted upon. Just as a quick outline for today, the presentation will have three main components. We will first do a quick overview of misogyny in Canada. We will then look at the importance of language and media framing, and then we will assess the labels extremism, violent extremism, and terrorism before wrapping up with a discussion and Q&A. But first, misogyny. So what is misogyny exactly? Misogyny has traditionally been understood as a hatred of, aversion to, or prejudice against women. However, in recent years, we've been gifted this updated understanding of misogyny by Kate Main, who is a professor at Cornell University. And Main redefines misogyny as a system that operates within a patriarchal social order to police and enforce women's subordination and uphold male dominance. So in other words, misogyny isn't just a feeling that men have towards women, it's a system that is designed to keep women in line with patriarchal norms and values. And I think it's important to note here that while any woman can experience misogyny in a patriarchal society, misogyny is most commonly directed towards women who violate these patriarchal norms or values in some way, shape, or form. And I think Catherine Switzer, who's pictured here on the screen, is a great example of that. She was the first woman to run the Boston Marathon officially, and as you can see, this was not an easy time for her. So Berit Brogard sums up misogyny nicely when she states, "A misogynist is not simply a person who hates women. It's a person who does or would hate women who are not subordinate." So like many things in our modern world, misogyny is largely fostered online. And this is often done through what has been deemed the manosphere, which refers to an online collective of communities that promote misogyny. Examples of these communities include men's rights activists, pickup artists, and men going their own way. However, the most demonstrably violent community in the manosphere is the incel community, of which Alec Manassian claimed allegiance, as incels have murdered at least 47 individuals in North America in the last 6 years. In fact, in the aftermath of the Toronto van attack, many incels celebrated Alec Manassian's actions and urged others to follow suit with their own rapes, acid attacks, and mass shootings. So the term incel is short for involuntary celibates. And incels blame women for their lack of romantic or sexual attachments. And the incel ideology is fundamentally underscored by a rejection of women's sexual emancipation, as they believe that women have too much power to choose their own sexual partners due to advancements made by feminism. Some incels even believe that women who deny them sex are committing, quote, reverse rape, which they state is just as harmful as actual rape. Now, incel forums use their own terminology, which I've included on the slide here. So, for example, attractive women are referred to as Stacies, attractive, successful men are referred to as Chads, and anyone outside of the incel culture is referred to as a normie. Now, Canada holds a reputation as a quite peaceful and progressive nation. However, it has a troubling position in the manosphere, and that is largely because Canada is the birthplace of the incel movement. The movement was created by a young bisexual woman named Alana in the 1990s, with the aim of creating an inclusive environment for those who had trouble finding relationships due to things like sexual orientation or even social awkwardness. However, the name has been co-opted by the male supremacist groups that we know today, with Alana comparing herself to a scientist who invented something that ended up being a weapon of war. Additionally, Canada tops the list for global interest in the aforementioned manosphere group Men Going Their Own Way, also known as MGTOW for short, according to Google Trends data. Now, if this name sounds familiar to you, it's probably because it made headlines last year in Canadian news when Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre was found to be using the MGTOW hashtag to quietly promote his videos on YouTube. It's important to note that aside from small advancements, such as Reddit banning certain incel forums, these groups have faced little accountability, and any change that has occurred has only happened after intense public scrutiny. So now, moving on to language and media framework. In the aftermath of the Toronto van attack, many media outlets struggled to make sense of the attack and its perpetrator. So was Alec Manassian a madman, a misogynist, a lone wolf extremist perhaps? As you can see from the screen, one journalist abandoned the notion of applying a label to Alec Manassian altogether, believing that it was a pointless exercise. And while identifying with the frustrated journalist is certainly understandable, I believe that the language that we use to describe these attacks is important and that we must assess it with careful consideration. So now saying that language matters is a simple enough statement, right? But we are currently in an academic institution, so we must back up our claims with scholarly evidence. So to do this, we are going to overcomplicate things just a little bit with fellow Canadian and communications scholar extraordinaire, Marshall McLuhan. In the 1960s, Marshall McLuhan coined the term, "the medium is the message," which I'm sure many of you are familiar with here today. So this means that the way we convey information, or the medium, is just as important as the information itself, or the message. One of my communications professors provided me with an analogy when I was first learning about the topic in undergrad, which I wanted to share with you today. He said that one of the simplest ways to understand the medium is the message is to compare it to a breakup, which is something I think we can all understand. So just imagine that you're in a relationship with someone that you no longer want to be in a relationship with. In this scenario, the message that you would need to convey is that this relationship is over. Now, there are several mediums or ways that you can convey this message. You can meet up and deliver this message face-to-face. You can text it to them, or you can choose to ghost them completely and have your absence speak for itself. Now, each of these mediums will impact the way that this breakup message will be understood by your soon-to-be ex-partner. So if you meet with them face-to-face, it's likely that your breakup message will be communicated clearly without any mishaps, and that your soon-to-be ex-partner will understand your feelings and exactly what is happening in this exact situation. However, if you decide to convey this message by ghosting your partner completely, it's likely that your soon-to-be ex-partner will be extremely confused by your absence, and they may even misinterpret this message completely by filing a missing persons report. And it's also likely that they will think you are a massive jerk when they find out that this was your way of breaking up with them. So aside from a small humor break, all of this is to say that the way we convey information is vital in how that information is perceived by others. Now, building on this, McLuhan identifies language itself as a medium that extends our thoughts from within our mind to others. This means that different words can greatly impact how a message is understood. So this fundamentally underscores the importance of choosing our words wisely to ensure that they are truly conveying the meaning of the message that we are trying to get across. Our linguistic choices are particularly important when they reach a large audience, as they do for those in the media. This is because the media has a great deal of control over how of news events are conveyed to and understood by the general public. A crucial aspect of this is media framing, which refers to the way that a given story is packaged and presented to consumers of news. And while media framing involves several aspects, such as the placement of a story or any visual aids that may accompany a story, language is perhaps one of the most crucial aspects of framing. And this is because, as we've discussed, the language used to convey media stories can drastically impact the way that they are understood by their audience. So to give you an idea of how powerful language and media framing can be, we can look back to the ways that the Montreal Massacre and Toronto van attack were framed. So for instance, when looking at the Montreal Massacre, the media coverage was deemed, quote, a second attack, and quote, another powerful assault on women. This is because the gendered nature of the attack was ignored by many media outlets, which depoliticized the nature of the attacks completely. And to put this into perspective, the Montreal Massacre was depoliticized so effectively that it was not officially recognized as an anti-feminist attack on its commemorative monuments until 2019, which was just a few short years ago. Media also repeatedly referred to the victims as daughters throughout their reporting, and the use of this word evoked childlike and helpless sentiments of the victims. However, it also overlooked the reasons why these women were targeted in the first place, and that's because they represented a change to the social order as women entering a male-dominated field. Looking back, journalists who covered the attack have deplored their own stories, with Shelley Page stating, quote, I fear I sanitized the events of its feminist anger and infantilized and diminished the victims, turning them from elite engineering students who'd fought for a place among men into teddy bear loving daughters, sisters, and girlfriends. Now, another problematic framework to emerge in the media discourse surrounding both the Montreal Massacre and the Toronto van attacks was that of uncorroborated mental illness, whereby questions surrounding the mental health of Mark Lepine and Alec Minassian superseded their violent acts and hateful motives. So for instance, after the Montreal Massacre, Lepine was deemed a madman fraught with mental illness and not a violent misogynist. So specifically, we can look here. CBC described Lepine as, quote, a mad killer, but negated the fact that he was only a killer of women. One psychiatrist stated that Lepine had succumbed to his own psychosis and was, quote, as innocent as his victims. And finally, another psychologist even theorized whether the massacre could be a consequence of Lepine having an absent father in childhood. Reports of the Toronto van attack followed a similar pattern despite taking place nearly 30 years later. So Minassian was described as, quote, a disturbed, lonely man and a loner who never spoke to anyone. One former classmate even tried to advocate for mental illness awareness when he stated, no, it's not a gender thing, focus on mental health. There's a lot of people with mental illnesses here and they're not being helped properly. We can also look at how the narrative of mental illness permeated the criminal court proceedings of Alec Minassian's trial. So Minassian's state of mind became the sole issue at trial after he admitted to planning and carrying out the Toronto van attack. And Minassian's defense team specifically argued that he was not criminally responsible for his actions due to his autism spectrum disorder, which they stated made Minassian unable to produce empathy or understand others' feelings. Now, throughout the course of the trial, Minassian was evaluated by 3 separate mental health teams, and we can draw some important conclusions on the framework of mental illness that has been attached to Alec Minassian and other perpetrators like him through the information that they gathered. So first, one mental health expert involved in the case described Minassian as, quote, a mass murderer who happens to have autism, rather than a man whose autism drove him to mass murder. Manassian himself even stated, quote, "I don't think I was mentally ill at the time, to be honest," which I'm sure his defense team was thrilled about. They also found that the attack was premeditated and took a considerable amount of time and energy to plan, or around 20 days in Manassian's estimation. He also set a goal for the amount of people that he hoped to kill, stating that he had hoped to kill 100, but that he was, quote, "satisfied with 10. His reasoning for the attack included the fact that he was lonely and worried that he would fail at his upcoming software development job, that he was afraid he would never have a relationship with a woman, and that he was infatuated with mass murder. Now, the teams also concluded that he was somebody who craved notoriety, which they said also contributed to his decision to commit the attack. So overall, this was a premeditated attack that was committed for clearly defined reasons by a man who wanted his actions to result in as much harm as possible in Canadian society. And of course, if you could not tell by now, the defense's argument was unsuccessful and Manassian was found guilty on all counts. I want to be clear here that in this argument, I'm not attempting to completely discredit the role that mental illness can play in acts of violence. The link between mental illness and violent crime has been studied quite extensively, and both medical and security experts agree that while mental illness can be one of several variables that can influence a person to commit an act of violence, it is not a predictor of violence. The FBI issued a report on this subject in the United States recently, and a quote from that report reads, "In light of the very high lifetime prevalence of symptoms of mental illness among the US population, formally diagnosed mental illness is not a very specific predictor of violence of any type, let alone targeted violence." While of course we must acknowledge that mental illness can play a part in acts of mass violence, it is one of many factors and is certainly not a driving force for the type of targeted violence that we are speaking about here today. So aside from the fact that research has not found a correlation between mental illness and mass violence, there are other issues that arise from this over-reliance on the mental illness narrative. The first is that focusing on uncorroborated claims of mental illness de-emphasizes the gendered motives for these attacks and absolves the attackers of agency for their crimes. Second is that the use of mental illness as a justification for misogynistic violence can misrepresent misogyny as a mental health problem. And many psychologists state that when someone holds these beliefs, that the issue often lies in their value system and not their psychology. The third is that this narrative perpetuates harmful stereotypes about the mentally ill by painting them as violent. As stated before, there is no causal evidence that mental illness is a factor for mass violence, and the Canadian Mental Health Association even states that those with mental illness are more likely to be victims of violent crime rather than perpetrators. The fourth and final issue is that this framework can impact the way that we understand and act upon these crimes. However, new frameworks can more adequately inform our understanding of the issue and our actions towards it, which leads us to the new framework of extremism, violent extremism, and terrorism. So we're talking about these labels, but what do they mean exactly? Extremism is a multifaceted term that can be understood as political ideologies that oppose a society's core values and principles, particularly any ideology that advocates racial or religious supremacy or opposes the core principles of democracy and human rights. Now, it's important to state that holding extremist views is not a crime in and of itself, as freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression is protected under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. However, if someone incites violence on account of these extremist beliefs, then that is indeed criminal and would constitute violent extremism. Now, extremist views are adopted through the gradual process of radicalization, and the radicalization process generally includes three main components. The first of which is being influenced by a socio-political issue. The second is a perceived injustice for which an individual feels entitled to redress. And the third being a myriad of vulnerability factors that increase a person's likelihood of identifying with extremist causes. And I've included a little chart on the screen here that includes some vulnerability factors. As you can see, they are relational, personal, social identity, psychological, and external in nature. Now, if we examine a misogynistic group such as incels, we can see that they fit all of the aforementioned components of radicalized extremism. So first, the socio-political issue that incels are influenced by is women's rights and feminism, as they believe that these advancements have specifically disadvantaged men. Second, the perceived injustice for which they feel entitled to redress is their involuntary celibacy, as they believe that women's rights and feminism have restricted their sexual access to women. Third, vulnerability factors are harder to discern, of course, but I think we can say with a reasonable degree of certainty that incels would be impacted by things like social isolation, difficult life events, or even polarizing societal debates. Additionally, as we've seen, incels have incited violence on account of these beliefs, which would constitute violent extremism. Now, before we dive into examining the term terrorism and its applicability to misogynistic violence, it's important to note that we do not have a universal definition for the term terrorism, which is something that has plagued terrorism studies for many years now. However, scholars have combed through various definitions of terrorism used around the world, and they have found that violence or threats of violence, politically motivated tactics, and fear are key characteristics that define terrorist acts, no matter what definition is used. So altogether, we can say that the use of violence, a political aim, and the spread of fear are central to terrorist acts. Bearing this in mind, we can generally understand terrorism as the calculated use of violence to create a general climate of fear in a population and thereby bring about a particular political objective. And this is just the definition I chose for the screen, but there are many out there that you can reference as well. Now, if we look at the Toronto van attack, once again, we can see that it fits all the characteristics of a terrorist act. Before the attack, Manassian directly stated his political aim in a Facebook post referencing the incel ideology, which I've included at the top of the screen here. He stated, "The incel rebellion has already begun. We will overthrow all the Chads and Stacys. All hail the supreme gentleman, Elliot Rodger." Elliot Rodger being an incel who undertook his own act of violence in the United States. His use of violence was the van attack that killed 10 people and injured many others. And finally, his attack did indeed spread fear throughout the Canadian population, with one victim stating that they were terrified that there were other men like Alec Manassian out there. However, Sarah Meagher states, "When is terrorism not terrorism? When the political motivations are misogyny." And this statement speaks to the challenges of labeling these acts as terrorism, not only in discourse, but in law. Now, there's nothing in the Criminal Code of Canada that prevents attacks that are motivated by misogyny as being treated as terrorism. And I've included the definition of terrorism as outlined in the Criminal Code on the screen here. However, in Canada, terrorism is treated as an aggravating factor in cases, which increases the severity of, quote, ordinary crimes. In these cases, elevated charges are also accompanied by an elevated burden of proof for the prosecution, which in plain English just means more work for the prosecution. This is not something that has traditionally been sought in these cases, despite the legal legitimacy that it would provide to victims. That is, until now. On a February afternoon in 2020, a 17-year-old boy walked into a Toronto massage parlor. He was armed with a 17-inch sword etched with the phrase "Thought Slayer" and a note that stated, "Long live the incel rebellion." He then proceeded to stab the receptionist at the parlor 42 times and seriously injure the parlor's owner before being apprehended by police. It was later revealed that the attacker found inspiration in Alec Manassian and the Toronto van attack. However, in a historical decision on June 6th of this year, the attack was deemed an act of terrorism by the Ontario Superior Court, marking the first time that an incel-inspired attack has been deemed an act of terrorism in Canadian history. And I must say, this research was completed before this decision was announced, so it was quite rare to see your research come to life right before your eyes like this. So although we failed to recognize these attacks for what they were in the past, these decisions show that there is hope for a more serious designation for these crimes in the future. So I know that was a lot of information to digest, so I summed up the key takeaways in these 3 bullet points. The first being that misogyny is not just a feeling, but a system that works to uphold a patriarchal social order, and police female behavior. Second, being that past language and frameworks have failed to convey the gendered nature of crimes that are motivated by misogyny, such as the Montreal Massacre and Toronto van attack, while relying on the harmful framework of mental illness. And the third being that the emerging frameworks of extremism, violent extremism, and terrorism can more adequately address the political and ideological nature of attacks that are motivated by misogyny. And before I wrap up, I just wanted to leave you with this quote by Rebecca Solnit. She states, "Language is power. When you turn torture into enhanced interrogation, or murdered children into collateral damage, you break the power of language to convey meaning, to make us see, feel, and hear." So I hope our time here today has helped to shed light on the importance of examining the language that we use to describe acts that are motivated by misogyny, as well as the possibility that new language can bring us closer to real change on this issue. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. It's Jason from the Moore Institute, and we will be very happy to, if you're willing, to field some questions. We will open it in the room, but also online, and so I'll be relying on my colleague, Dr. Standish, to keep track of the room. I'll be watching online. For those that are online, as mentioned before, please either type in a question in the Q&A, or you may raise your hand and bring voice to your question. So feel free to do that, and I open the floor. Thank you, Ashley.
Questions for Ashley? Please.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation, Ashley. It's very interesting, and to be honest, it's my first time even to hear such kind of horrible things happen in Canada or anywhere else. And usually when I read or hear about like targets, when women are targeted, it's about war, it's civil war, and something like that. And currently, I'm from Ethiopia. Ethiopia is in civil war, and historically, the country has passed a number of civil wars. But right now, even targeting women is widespread compared to even the war situation that happened like 30 decades ago. So recently, even government soldiers, anywhere, even mobs attack women, rape, and even mothers are targeted. So it's not something isolated issue. It's widespread, and it's really I don't know. It's very difficult to comprehend what's going on. So, do you think this has direct relation with misogyny, or is it like I don't know what's hitting the world? So, if you have some understanding outside, like internationally, worldwide, like perspectives regarding misogyny and attacks, horrible attacks that targets women.
Yeah, so if I understand your question correctly, then you're just referring to how misogyny can kind of manifest in different countries.
Or is like misogyny has impacted even the way people think, even welfare and so on, or is it vice versa?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I think that misogyny is really manifesting in different ways around the world right now. So in Canada, we see really, really high rates of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, family violence, and we're also seeing this rise in kind of like this incel manosphere-based violence. But this isn't necessarily the case everywhere around the world. We have many conflicts happening, so we have a lot of conflict-related sexual violence, rapes. We're seeing in Ukraine especially a lot of kind of like sexual-based violence. So I don't necessarily think that it's going to look the same in every place. I think misogyny kind of manifests in different ways depending on where you are, depending what's happening in that area. So yeah, I think that I think this issue is particularly apparent in Canada and the United States, as well as some places in Europe. But misogyny looks different in other places in the world. But I think at the end of the day, the aim is the same. Like I said, the goal is to police female behavior and ensure that they kind of conform to this, patriarchal norms and values in some way, shape, or form, no matter where you are in the world. So I hope that answers your question somewhat. Yeah, thanks.
Good question online.
Yes. Okay. Hi, Ashley. Thank you so much for the information. Yeah, that was a great lecture. That I learned a lot from that. One thing that I'm wondering, so I'm actually a school teacher, and part of why I attended this lecture is just because this is a conversation that's coming up even within our school system. And I'm wondering if you guys are seeing any statistics sort of giving us an idea on the age range that incels are typically becoming active. Like, is it something that seems to be happening to more of an adult demographic, or is it something that we're starting to see also kind of in those teen years maybe, or sort of younger demographic?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I don't have a specific age range that I can give you. However, I was recently at a conference in Iceland, and one of the speakers there has done a lot of work on incel-related violence. And one of the things he stated is that younger and younger men are being drawn into the manosphere, and particularly incel groups. So we're really seeing probably school-age children that you would be, teaching and working with, being drawn into this kind of misogyny-based online network of groups. So it is something that is becoming increasingly prevalent amongst these younger school-aged children, which is something that is, of course, quite concerning to, I think, everybody, and especially people working in the field.
Thanks, Ashley, for that. But this might be a question a little bit more directed to like the police, but are these websites, are they on the dark web? Are they being monitored? And I know you said these, extreme ideas and beliefs are not a crime in itself, but if these websites are leading to acts of violence, are they illegal? And like where's the justice system at with monitoring that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So many of these incel forums were just on any kind of websites that are widely available that many people use, and it was really big on Reddit for a long time. So Reddit is, of course, like a forum that, I don't know, like thousands of people are using at any given minute. So widely available, publicly accessible, and that is where these forums lived for a very long time, which is, of course, as I mentioned in the presentation, it's very difficult to get them off of these websites. And the only reason that Reddit ended up banning certain incel forums is because the backlash became just humongous, and then they finally decided to take some of these forums down. But if if I'm not mistaken, I believe some may still be up. Like, I don't believe that they banned every forum on Reddit. As far as the dark web, I couldn't tell you. I haven't been on there myself, but there is a website called We Hunted the Mammoth. And it's a man who has basically undertaken it upon himself to dive into these forums. So he's an active member on these forums, and he is on this forum to report back to other people on his blog about what is being said. So that is a really interesting resource to kind of look into if you wanted to look into it further. As far as like kind of where we're at for like kind of how we're treating this, what many people would consider hate speech in many ways. Like I said, unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people are seeing it that way yet. Like, it is very hateful rhetoric that is being spewed on these forums. I would personally consider it hate speech, but I think that many people have treated it as, you know, these people have freedom of, like I said, thought, belief, opinion, and expression, and so long as they're not inciting violence on account of these beliefs, then it's technically legal. So I think there is kind of a divide on that, right? And now that we're seeing attacks being perpetrated in the name of incel violence from these forums that are discussing these misogynistic, really kind of hateful ideas, I think people are starting to take it a little more seriously now. But I think, like, as we see in Ontario, the law enforcement has decided to try this individual as a terrorist. So yeah, I think we're gaining a little traction, but I think a lot of people still are just really focused on giving these people their freedom of thought, freedom of belief, expression, even if that is hurting women around Canada and the US mostly. So I hope that answers your question in some way.
Yes, thank you.
We have another question online. So the question is this: is misogyny different or the same as gender-based violence? I guess she's looking for your view on that. Is misogyny always the same as gender-based violence? Are these the same things?
They definitely work in tandem. So, like I said, misogyny is that, you know, kind of broad structure that is designed to police and enforce women's behavior. I would kind of view gender-based violence as an arm of misogyny. It's kind of like the enforcing arm, because a lot of the time we enforce women to conform to these patriarchal norms and values by hurting them or threatening to hurt them. So I would say that gender-based violence is one way of ensuring that, you know, these misogynistic goals are met by those who want to keep them in place.
I have a question. I was wondering, because you mentioned this successful example where someone was convicted for terrorism.
I'm sorry, do you mind speaking up just a little? I can't hear you.
Yeah, so you mentioned this successful example where someone was convicted for terrorism, and then you mentioned domestic violence, and I was wondering where Canada's at with like recognizing domestic violence or murders of women by their partners or men in their surroundings as femicides, because I think that's somewhat related. So I was just wondering where Canada is at.
Absolutely, and we were actually just talking about this, Katerina and I, before the lecture. I think we still have quite a ways to go in terms of recognizing, you know, domestic violence as femicide. Most of the work I do actually revolves around domestic violence at Resolve, that was mentioned before. And to be honest, I think we're making much more progress on this issue that I was talking about today than we are in recognizing domestic violence as a form of femicide. But yeah, like I said, it's by and large the most prevalent type of gender-based violence we're seeing in Canada. And it is kind of, in a way, an intimate form of terrorism, right? Like the domestic abuser terrorizes the victim in their own ways. So yeah, unfortunately, I really have not heard a lot in terms of making headway on that. But I do hope that we can be here one day talking about a time when that is true.
I was wondering, because you mentioned, like on social media, a lot of this is like hate speech. So I was wondering, is anything being done from a legal standpoint to hold the social media companies accountable for not doing anything? it is hate speech and if it is promoting violence and encouraging these men to go out and commit mass murder, is anything being done on that side of things?
Nothing that I know of, nothing that I came across in my research, and that was one of the reasons that I really wanted to dive into this topic, because if we saw somebody inciting violence on account of religious or cultural or other kind of political reasons, I think it would be treated quite differently. The fact that people are inciting violence on account of misogyny, it just seemed like absolutely nothing was being done, and no one was really caring. And like I said in the presentation, any change that did occur only happened after massive, intense backlash. So I don't know of anything that is being done on account of like if we're talking social media, like Reddit or Twitter or Instagram or whatnot. I'm not aware of anything at the moment, unfortunately.
Well, I just learned that the Canadian legal code doesn't have hate crimes as a crime. Like people are fined or charged with assault or murder, but a hate crime isn't actually in the code, so you can't be charged with a hate crime in Canada right now. So it's interesting how it's either a regular crime or terrorism.
Yeah.
Which is not surprising that not many people are charged with terrorism because it's such a leap from crime.
Yeah, and it's interesting during the course of the research that terrorism it's not a crime in and of itself as the same way that murder is. It's an aggravating factor that's added on to murder or whatever crime was committed. So that has definitely, I think, complicated the process of treating certain acts as terrorism, for sure.
Can I ask you a question from a communications perspective? What term would you prefer to differentiate these forms of violence? Because there are so many terms out there, everything from family violence, which erases gender, to gender-based violence, to violence against women and girls, to misogyny, misogynoir. There's so many different terms that encompass these forms of deliberate subordination and penalty for a person's identity. What helps from a communication perspective? And I think that one of the things about your research that I find so compelling is that you're really doing an analysis of how this is being communicated as a way of elevating the reality, which seeks to erase so many forms of these points of violence. And my question really relates to this notion of extremism. What do we call regular misogyny and regular violence against women and girls as opposed to extremist forms? Can you hold these thoughts but not act on them? I mean, I'm just curious what your thoughts would be.
Sure. So are you looking specifically at what terms we should use to kind of describe these acts or just regular acts of?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a spectrum, would misogynistic terrorism relate to mass violence?
Yeah, I specifically like using the term gender-based extremism or gender-based terrorism. I like that term specifically because it also is kind of all-encompassing of acts perhaps that are undertaken, if we want to, maybe if it's motivated by gender or sexual orientation, gender expression and sexual orientation, I should say. So I kind of that's one term that I've really liked using, gender-based extremism, gender-based terrorism, to describe these acts. And yeah, I think that's an interesting question you bring up, and maybe that's the next next research paper idea that you're giving me here. But I do think we need to get as specific as possible while also using terms that kind of enable us to include as many groups as possible. Like I said, because a lot of times misogyny and homophobia, transphobia, we're really discussing very similar kind of iterations of hate. So yeah, I think that would be the term that I kind of prefer to use for these acts, and that I would kind of like to be seeing used moving forward. I think that if we just use obviously misogyny is a part of it, extremism is a part of it, terrorism is a part of it, but specifically kind of grouping those ideas together. And I think it's particularly important that we note that if an act of extremism or terrorism is happening, what is it happening for? You know, it's gender-based, or you know, it's politically motivated extremism or whatnot, right? So I think we need to be specific about why this act of extremism or terrorism is happening in any given circumstance. So.
I guess that if we don't have any more questions for Ashley, I'm going to thank everybody for coming and joining us today for this brown bag. I learned a lot today. Thank you. I really appreciate that you brought this information to the Brown Bag Lecture Series, and it's been extremely informative. Thank you everybody for coming in person, and thank everybody for coming online. And thank you again, Ashley.